this week's vintage cake, and I've only used 4 piping tips to create this. I'll show you step by step how it's done, and by the end of this video you can create your own vintage cake. I'll be sharing all my tips and tricks, so let's get into it. This is my 6-inch hard cake with 2 layers plus filling, and it will probably give you around 8 servings. Because I work with fluffy sponges and I usually make my cakes 1 day in advance, I always like to soak my sponges with some sugar syrup. This will keep the sponges nice and moist. Then I'm going to be using my buttercream to create a little bit of a dam on the outside. This will prevent my filling from falling out the sides. Now I wanted to try something new here. I keep hearing these Latin American bakers rave about this filling, and I had to try it. So it's dulce de leche, and I'm just adding a little bit of a thin layer before I'm gonna add my creamy fillings, and it was so delicious. I can highly recommend. Drop a comment if you want this recipe. Now when you are going to add your second layer on top, you want to make sure it's already a little bit aligned with the bottom layer. Get it on there as straight as possible. That will prevent you from having to use lots and lots of buttercream to get the cake in a straight shape. I'm going to be soaking my second sponge as well with some sugar syrup, and I'm just applying a little bit buttercream on the outside because I can see my filling trying to creep out. Then onto the crumb coat. This is a thin layer of buttercream we're going to apply to lock in all those loose crumbs. So you're just going to apply a generous layer of buttercream everywhere around your cake, and then you're going to use your scraper to go around the sides to scrape off all that excess buttercream. Now it's pretty important that you hold your scraper straight on a 90-degree angle, so the bottom of your scraper is aligned with your board and the side of your scraper is aligned with your cake. Now it's pretty important that you're going to set the shape of your cake already with your crumb coat. The neater the shape of your crumb coat is, the neater your final coat is going to look onto your cake. So you can see I'm trying to fill that big gap on the back of my cake, and there's also a few other small gaps that I'm just going to fill up. Hard cakes are a bit trickier than round ones, and the things I mainly struggle with is to get that really sharp point at the bottom to really define the hard shape. And at the back of my heart, I always struggle when I'm scraping. I usually always scrape too much off. So what I'm doing here to prevent that is I'm already going to apply a thicker layer of buttercream on the back of my hard cake because I don't want my sponges to peek through after my final coat. I feel like I always scrape off too much buttercream on that part of the cake. So I'm just going to prevent that already by adding an extra thick crumb coat on that side. And for the pointy bit at the bottom of your heart, you really want to make sure you stop scraping there, and then put your scraper back and scrape the other side of the cake. Before I was just doing it in one movement, and that would turn my pointy bit round. Now you want to make sure your crumb coat is completely chilled before you're going to apply your final coat. You can test this by gently tapping your finger on your crumb coat, and if it feels firm and there's no more excess buttercream on your finger, you're good to go for your final coat. Then I'm going to apply a generous layer of buttercream on the outside, and I'm really focusing on the top bits already because that's where I usually don't put enough buttercream. Then I'm going to scrape most of the buttercream off, and then I'm going to be using that buttercream, that leftover buttercream on my scraper to fill up any gaps. You can really see the top side needs lots and lots of extra buttercream. Like I said before, make sure you stop scraping at the pointy bit of your heart to really get that pointy definition in there. Then you are going to repeat this process until you're happy with the shape of your cake. You want to make sure you hold that scraper nice and straight, align it with your board, hold it on a 90-degree angle, and then just keep filling up the gaps until there's no gaps anymore and your cake is smooth. You can already see my crumb coat peeking through there at the back of my cake, so I'm just going to be applying lots and lots of extra buttercream because I always feel at that part, I always take off too much buttercream. Now the buttercream that's sticking upwards, I am just going to use my spatula to scrape it all in, and then when I'm happy with my shape, I'm just going to go over it one more time to get it smooth and perfect. Well, perfect, it doesn't necessarily have to be 100% perfect. That's the thing I really like about vintage cakes, because I'm going to be covering most of it up anyway with my borders. And see how I'm creating little ripples on the side of my cake? This is also not good. It's probably me putting too much pressure on that scraper. And I also feel if you hold your scraper a little bit more towards you, like closer to the cake, you're putting less pressure, so there's less chance of those ripples. This is going to be good enough for me because the design I have in mind, we're not even going to see much of the bottom base cake. I'm going to go all out with this design. I'm going to be using big piping tips and big bold borders, and because it's also a 2-layer cake, there's not too much space left over to decorate on the sides.
Never overfill your piping bag. If you have too much buttercream in your piping bag, it's going to be really hard to give that pressure. And also stay on top of your piping bag. Never let it go floppy. Make sure after a bit you twist it up again. And you want to make sure you keep your other hand free so you can spin the turntable. How to pipe shells. You want to squeeze, stop squeezing, and pull away. You really want to pull away quite dramatically at the end to create that till. Now there's two ways to pipe hard vintage cakes, and one way is that you're gonna let your shells go all the way around, or you can let the ends meet at the pointy bit. In the beginning, I found it easier to just go all the way around in one movement, but I really like the look of how I'm doing it now, where you're working your way around both sides of the cake. Back to the petal tip, and then I'm going to be applying the same border that I've applied at the bottom of my cake. But this border I am going to go all the way around in one motion. You can just easily stop this border and make sure you twist up your piping bag. Don't let it go floppy because you won't be able to give even pressure. Also, make sure the skinny bit is on the outside because that will give you that sharp definition in your border. And then I'm going to be applying a second border on the inside to hold up my shells, or else my shells are going to be too big and they're going to fall off. But then you want to make sure the skinny bit of your piping tip is pointing inwards because that is the part you're going to be seeing. Now you can see my shells are not the perfect shape, and what is happening here, there's a little bit of excess buttercream on my piping tip, so you also want to make sure you stay on top of that. I just have a little tissue ready and I just keep wiping it off as I go. Then onto the leaf tip. Well, I hardly use it to actual pipe leaves. This is my favorite piping tip for vintage cakes, and I think it's really beginner friendly as well. Then I'm going to be using my piping bag to make little indents in the side of my cake and create some sort of guideline where my ruffles are going to be placed, because I like it when they come out evenly, and I don't feel like I'm confident enough to do it completely freehand yet. So this is a little trick that I do. I find it easiest to stop after each ruffle before I start the new one, and I'm doing this lap over technique, so I'm making them lap over a little bit. I just really like the look of it. If you're not 100% confident, I highly recommend to practice on a plate first. Then to complete the look, I'm going to add a single shell that faces down where my ends meet, and you want to pull away quite dramatically at the end to create that till on the end of your shell. Now you can see I'm losing a bit of definition in the shape of my shells, so I'm just going to clean my piping tip and try again. Look, that looks much better. Then I'm going to add a few pearls at the end of those shells. I just really like the look of that. And of course we need a few cute bows, and here's how you tie a bow. You want to make 2 loops and then tie those both loops together. Just make a knot in those loops. And bows need some love and some fluffing up, so you want to be sticking your pointy fingers in the loops and then use your other fingers to straighten it up and to give it a little bit shape, and that way if it's uneven you can pull the ends to make the loops the same size. Make sure the ends are the same length, and I like to cut them a little bit on an angle for that extra cute look. As long as your buttercream is still soft, you can just stick the bows in there and they should just stick by itself, and then after you can just put it in the fridge. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to learn more about vintage cakes.